Okay, good. Great to see everybody. We're excited to have such a great crowd here. Been a huge response to this topic. SID is the only professional association for international development professionals, and we reach across the full diversity of all the different organizations working in international development. And our mission is to achieve better development outcomes by bringing diverse constituencies together so that we can debate critical ideas, policies, and practices that will shape our global future. And we are definitely doing that today. This year's program theme for SID is Common Ground on Foreign Aid, Deepening the Dialogue. We have a lot of wonderful programs planned, and we have a special series, and today is the launch of that special series on the future of foreign aid under the Obama administration. And we're really excited to launch that special series today with this panel on delivery mechanisms for aid that works. We're interested in helping to create and bring forward the history that we all have in development with different delivery mechanisms and make that data and experience available as a lot of decisions are being made by the Obama administration, whether in the QDDR process, the Presidential Study Directive 7 process, or what have you. So we're excited today to be doing that and have such a distinguished panel, excuse me, that will comment on all of those things and bring a lot, and I expect that there will be a very lively Q&A to follow. A lot of people out there in the audience that know a lot about this topic. Let me also mention that we've got a lot of interesting events coming up. I want to especially flag our January 27th annual dinner. And I don't know if you all went to the dinner this week. How many people went to the USGLC dinner this week? So they're really fun, and we have another one in store for you at the end of January. We have Senator Lugar confirmed and Senator Kerry wanting to come, and we hope to firm that up soon and to be able to pay tribute to these two senators for all that they have done in advancing foreign aid reform on the Hill. There are a number of other activities coming up, and you probably all grabbed a couple of leaflets on those. We will be doing the second in the series on the future of foreign aid under the Obama administration on January 13th with an insider's view of foreign aid reform from key Hill staffers. I think the upshot of all of that is that if you are not a member, you certainly feel like you want to become one. Am I right? Feeling in this group that that's what you want to do immediately. So we have membership forms right outside. We would really love it if any of you in the room are not members, and also would direct you to say hi to a couple of staff, ask any questions you may have about SID to them. Joe Foyer, our executive director. Stacy Whittle, our communications officer. And then I think Janine Kamweni and Manoli Strecker are outside in the hall. Anyway, they do a fabulous job. If you're not a member, I hope you will join. I'd now like to introduce Tony Barkley, who really doesn't need much of an introduction because he's an eminence grise in our community. Tony has also been a former past president of SID. He is president of the Center for Global Engagement, which is part of the USGLC. And he has recently set up a new NGO called the Development Practitioners Forum. And he can tell us a little bit about that. But its mission is much like what we are doing today, and that is how do we bring what we know forward and apply it so that we're not all reinventing the wheel. And with that, let me turn it over to Tony. Thank you.
Thanks, Betsy. It's great to be with all of you here today, and we really have an exceptional panel and a great opportunity both to hear from them and then to pose questions. So Each of the panelists will speak for about 15 minutes. I'll act as a kind of gentle timekeeper, and we'll have at least an hour for Q&A with them once you've heard from them. As you came in, I hope many of you at least were able to pick up a one handout which looks like this. And we won't be, I'm not going to present what is here so much as just mention it that it offers you kind of a cheat sheet or a frame of reference for some of the topics that I know our panelists are going to talk about. We actually had a couple of conference calls to try to prepare ourselves and make sure that as we bring different perspectives and different experience to the conversation, that we could touch on some common themes that are of interest to everyone who's here today. So in this handout that I held up, there is a page that lists 11, I think it is, and that list kind of stopped just because I ran out of space on this slide. Different instruments and some of the broad trends of the last 30 years in terms of when and how those instruments have been used. And there's a pretty broad range of them. And some of them are being considered and being discussed, perhaps to be either reintroduced or given greater emphasis under the Obama administration's reform proposals. So I think there's a widespread sense that we will see substantial change. There's a widespread view that the system for delivering U.S. foreign assistance, if not broken, is at least has a lot of parts that might be almost worn out. Everyone has opinions on that. And we will ask our panelists to touch on their own experience and to offer some views. And I'll give them, as I introduce them, a couple of things that are just sort of framing questions. The second slide here talks about trade-offs influencing the choice of instrument. Again, use this as kind of a backdrop for the conversation because on that page you have, again, I think it's 11, different priorities that different stakeholders in the U.S. foreign assistance community put different levels of emphasis on. And those would range from emphasis on maximum competition for all comers, lowering all entry barriers, to emphasis on using host country governments and NGO institutions, to different emphasis in terms of how much reporting is involved, how much funding uncertainty there might be, what are the expectations between the U.S. entity, particularly a USAID mission, and an implementing partner. People have different preferences. I will tell you, because I know the panel agrees on this one, that there is no way that any of us have seen to optimize all 11 of these things equally at the same time. You just can't do it. So when you hear a reform proposal, it's sometimes, I think, helpful to say, what is really most important in the mind and the voice of someone advocating that we do more of something and less of something else? It's kind of a good indicator. And it doesn't mean that person is necessarily got it wrong or that they will get to dictate how things get sorted out. But these are very, very serious trade-offs. It's good to have them sort of out in front of us as we think about both where we've been and where we would go. Our panelists bring immense experience across different roles in different organizations. Their bios are in your hands, and I think it would be unfair to all of you to go through and read that to you. But if you take a look at what Diana Esposito has done as a procurement officer and a contracting officer and a policy specialist in USAID, in other federal agencies, and now at ECDI-VOCA, you see that kind of breadth of experience and really understanding both the instruments and the kinds of trade-offs that I've just referenced. If you look at Tim Beans, who's known to many people because he works right in this building, but who's got great experience in USAID as a mission director, as the procurement executive for the agency, as a field contracting officer with the FAA, and now here at Chemonics with a leading implementing partner, and someone whose understanding of the community was evidenced when he was selected as the public sector partner of the year several years ago at the Greater Washington Government Contractors event. And Rodney Bent, Rodney, who many of you know from his time at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, previously at OMB with time with the Coalition Provisional Authority in Baghdad, and now at Booz Allen. Again, you have people who have seen it all, or virtually everything on the two sheets that I distributed. And I'm going to ask them to particularly focus on three questions. First, I think, would be from their own experience, what are some of the most significant lessons they would point to about what has worked, what worked perhaps best in a given circumstance, what things we have learned in terms of improving any of the instruments going forward. Second, I'd like them to speak to how the Obama administration's reform initiatives, the Presidential Study Directive and the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, how should they address the trade-offs? And in today's context, which factors do our panelists think might be most important? And finally, and this is where I think the conversation with all of you and the way we wrap this session up later will help us, is how can the SID-Washington community help those who are leading these initiatives arrive at sound policy choices that are based on evidence rather than purely on opinion? Evidence is kind of hard to round up and hard to locate on some of these things. Opinion is abundant, and we all have them. But I think that's going to be a really important criterion. I know that from talking with some of the leaders of the QDDR, the principle of evidence-based decision is very important to them, and I think our community has a really good role to play there. So without further ado, let me ask Diana Esposito to lead off for the panel.
Thank you. When I was first asked to speak here, I just assumed it would be a group of about 15, 20 people would be interested in this topic. And when I found out the number, I kept asking people, saying, why are so many people interested in this, and what do they expect to hear? And I was told this morning by Mike Walsh, oh, they only want to know the answer. Great, thank you, Mike. Not too much pressure. The answer is, when you're looking at choice of instrument, it's an answer no one wants to hear, but it is the answer, is it depends. There are instances when the federal agency, whether it be aid or HHS or energy, needs contracts, and there are instances when it would be cooperative agreements. Keep in mind, and I do have a handout that you should have, it's a two-page, I think it's two double-side pages. Most of you got. And when I try to compile, it just said what this is really variations on a theme. Keep in mind there are only two basic instruments. Whether it's a grant, cooperative agreement, contract, doesn't matter. Two basic instruments are, it's either fixed price or it's cost reimbursable. And everything is just variations on a theme. The one, just hearkening to the basic question, is there's the basic thing that the federal government has to consider is really risk management. That gets to the trade-offs. That's what a trade-off is risk management. What is the ultimate goal they are trying to achieve? That should be the driver to the type of instrument. The other thing to keep in mind that I wanted to impress on this group in working with the higher political types at the agency as they're trying to formulate things is the one thing that I haven't seen too much of now being on this side versus having worked for the government is there seems to be an inherent lack of flexibility on the part of implementers. So there are a myriad of instruments and variations thereof that aid has access to. Under the Foreign Assistance Act of 1931, I think it's Section 635B, it gives a federal agency an enormous amount of authority to do contracts, grants, endowments, and one phrase I love, other instruments. Lots of flexibility in there. Other federal agencies, when I was at AID, some of the innovations that I was, patted on the back for, in fact, weren't. They were just sort of things I borrowed from what I saw other federal agencies do. They're fixed obligation grants, something I borrowed from, I think it was HUD and Department of Energy were doing. So I think one of the things in looking at, as Tony was saying, where are the past lessons? A lot of the past lessons aren't just at aid. Aid does, of course, have that experience, the development experience. That is part of what their mandate is, what they do. Some of that is different. Some of it really isn't. They are a federal agency, and I just saw a kind of a lack of looking at what other federal agencies do, a lot of innovations that other federal agencies do. They could just easily borrow from that, and also then flow it down. Give it to the implementers, and let the implementers have a lot of this flexibility. And that seems to be absent because there seems to be just a general lack of knowledge and understanding of what these basic authorities are. So just kind of briefly go through this list. Fixed obligation grants. And what I try to lay out on here, it just sort of understanding of what the authorities are, considerations for recipient, considerations for aid, that's your trade-offs, that's your risk management. And then some of my thoughts that are just, as Tony mentioned, we all have opinions, these are just mine, on what I'm seeing is sort of underutilization by the implementer of this type of instrument. This is a wonderful instrument. When you're overseas working with tiny organizations, you need to get specific objectives done. Wonderful instrument. A lot of people are just are not aware of this. It's not publicly known, even though it is an ADS 303. There's just a lot of hesitancy in using it because it does look different from the standard aid type cost reimbursable instrument. Leveraging versus cost share. Cost share is something any of us who've received cooperative agreements is familiar with. Leveraging, great use of term aid has sort of embraced lately. But I just think, again, it's being underutilized. This is something working in cooperative agreement world easily can do. This makes everyone look great. The benefit is you don't have that same burden that you have with cost share of all of those O&B rules for documentation. What you can do is work with a lot of other partners, get credit for it, but more importantly, aid gets credit for it and can present it a bigger looking program to Congress. It's something that, again, it's a little bit known in the agency, not very well known on the implementing side. Leader with Associate Awards, another innovation aid has done. Again, I think as implementers, we can take this and use this as we're giving out sub-grants, whether we're a contractor or a cooperative agreement recipient. But take this, see what the model is, and then start adapting it for your own implementing purposes. In-kind grants, similar to fixed obligation grants. Here, if your benefit is, if your intention is to help small organizations, very beneficial. You can then take this, you purchase items, hand it off, actually give it to the local organizations. Most beneficial for smaller companies, smaller structures, but again, being underutilized. I think there's just one or two models that aid and we are used to working with, so start seeing what else is out there. Host country contracts, and this is, Rodney is going to talk, I think, a little bit about host country contracts. Something aid worked with years ago, lots of, pluses and minuses in that. It can work well when you're dealing with, and again, it would be an aid decision, but where you're working with the government that can handle the funding, just aid giving them the funding, and then you have management in there. Downside is both the agency and we, as the implementers, would have less authority as far as actually decision making. But there are some real benefits in there as far as, again, what is the intention of the program? If the intention of the program is to do capacity building within the host country government, this could be the way to do it. I have never heard this being used on an implementing side, and it's possible that it would be a very viable method. So we need that authority, though, to go in and proceed and saying this is the best way to go ahead. Some of you might have an older version of the form. The next thing on the list should be public-private alliance, the GDA agreements. The aid has been working with these for the past 5 years, I believe, maybe a little longer. Is it longer? 10? See, they're not really that well known. This does go to a lot of the leveraging I was talking about before, but it's an effort aid made that is interesting. It's working with It could be a nonprofit or a for-profit, but you get together with some established company, some producer, in a country, and you try to basically create, in some instances, a real value chain for them. So it could be a tomato producer that they just want to take the assets and they can help create the value chain. The problem here is that if these are not well organized, that you can get conflicts of interest as far as what USAID's interest is, what you as the implementer's interest is, and then what the GDA partner, what their interest is. These can work. I just think the agency hasn't really, at least from what I've seen, hasn't really focused on the real dynamics and the purpose and use for these instruments. And a lot of times they'll sort of pull together a cooperative agreement, plug in this GDA alliance side to it, and you're sitting there trying to figure out how are these things coordinating, and the answer is not well. But they can work. And again, this is something, I have 3 minutes. This is something that can work on the implementing side. So if you have a contract or a program that you're doing something, take a look at the authority under this, under ADS 303, take a look at the aid website. This is something that you as the implementer can envision working, then go in and get that authority and start proceeding with this. The interagency agreements, agency to agency. Aid has been doing this for a long time. They'll give money to, for example, the Forest Service or USDA, and just say, well, they get people overseas. This, it can be very useful. What would be an interesting tie-in where you're working on programs where you know that there's programmatic expertise here that head in Washington, D.C., at other federal agencies talk to aid. This is something that they might be able to more easily get someone there to provide additional expertise and support to your program. Endowments. Endowments, for some reason, for the past, at least 10 years, has become a negative word. I don't know why. Again, AID has incredible authority as other transactions. Endowments can be a very, very useful instrument, especially where it encourages long-term organizational sustainability. That's the intention of your program. Look at this. The authority is already in there. Nothing new has to be created. Excess U.S. government property. This is sort of a dream of mine that never be a way. We all know there's a lot of property out there. I don't know that aid has the capacity really to keep managing what is out there and keep transferring it between organizations, but there's got to be better use, better access, whether you can get it as a new implementer or to subs, to local organizations to help sustain it. This goes hand in glove with the in-kind grant programs. Local currency trust, program trusts. It's rare but aid does do this. They have in-country that they can have separate pot of funds that's considered local government funds. This, its mission decides on this, on how to expend this. Not everybody is aware of this, what the use of it. The beauty of it is it often, because of the way it's been generated, can often be a program income type of generation back to aid. It often can come outside of the OMB A122 or the cost principle rules. So there's access there that I think there's just a general unawareness that there's money. There could be money that's sitting out in the missions that can be used in totally different ways from the standard regulatory types. And last but not least, contracts. The basic contract types, cost reimbursement is what we've seen, fixed price, loaded rate, IQCs, all various. Again, what you're going to see here in the contract types is very similar to what I had here, just going to kind of be variations on a theme. But again, what I'm seeing as an implementer is just that one mindset. This is what we got. We have to flow it down like that to any of our subs. And the answer is, no, you don't. Yes, you can. No, you don't. You can take what you have a lot of authority there, a lot of flexibility in going in there and seeing what are the basic needs of the program. How to meet those needs through a lot of creativity in accordance with the basic standards, basic authority aid has.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
That was a tour de force. I don't know who could cover that material in 15 minutes other than Diana. Very helpful. Tim Beans?
Thanks, Tom.
Got it.
Well, it's really an honor for me to address such a distinguished audience. A lot of close friends in the audience, a lot of colleagues I've worked with for years, so it's really good. And I'd like to thank Betsy and SID for putting together these forums so we have an opportunity to talk about some really important issues to the development community. Well, it's the holiday season, and I'm really feeling good about a lot of wonderful things that are happening. Good news is happening to an agency that I have developed a large part of my professional career to supporting. The Development Leadership Initiative is bringing intelligent, enthusiastic talent back to the agency, and we're starting to build up the human capacity we need to restore AID's effectiveness and leadership. A new administrator, Dr. Rajiv Shah, probably will be approved as early as this Friday to lead the agency. Certainly, USGLC has done a remarkable job of securing much-needed increases in the 150 account during a very deep and long-running economic crisis. And Congress has expressed support for increasing funding for both diplomacy and development, increasing the size of the Foreign Service at both state and the Department of Defense. Certainly, both agencies owe a debt of gratitude to Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton and to Secretary of Defense Robert Gates for their strong support. I actually believe Secretary Gates may be the new patron saint of both agencies. I believe it was Secretary Gates going up to the Hill and saying that he cannot win the wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan with kinetic power on the ground, and that he needed the civilian instruments in national security, diplomacy, foreign assistance, economic reconstruction and development, the so-called soft powers, to be successful. I think his ability to reach to a much broader section of Congress than the development community did alone helped bring awareness to this very, very important issue. Certainly, we'll hit upon a lot of some of the fundamental concepts that generally favor certain types of delivery mechanisms over another to meet a specific desired outcome. The key for USAID is to select the most appropriate delivery mechanism available to address the range of issues which they are trying to improve and the desired outcomes which they would like to measure. What is critically important for from USAID's perspective is the need to maintain a variety of diverse contract vehicles to address the numerous different needs and requirements to fill its diversified mission. For example, if USAID wants to support a particular development need in an area where relationships with the local population are critically important to success, I would think an assistant instrument may be the most appropriate use of that particular vehicle. Many of the excellent NGOs and PVOs that work in this arena and that are in this room have worked for years in countries that require local knowledge and trust of people so that they can be much more effective in their work and reach their results that they are trying to achieve. That same trust and that long-developed relationship has made it difficult for them to embrace the new counterinsurgency or COIN language being inserted in assistance instruments in Afghanistan and Pakistan. They argue with a high degree of concern and urgency that affiliation with the military can put their employees in danger and threaten their ability to work effectively with these groups in the future. But USAID has said they absolutely need civilian support to be successful, and as I have stated earlier, Secretary Gates has said he cannot win without this soft power supporting the war effort. For those of us working in both countries, the strategy in Afghanistan and Pakistan has been adjusted a number of times in the last year. I would argue in the last couple of weeks, and I have checked my emails this morning. If USAID is working in an environment where foreign policy is changing directions and the development community is being directed to change their technical focus to a different set of priorities to meet these directives, then I think I could effectively argue acquisition may be a more appropriate vehicle. Again, what is critical is critically important from USAID's perspective is the need to maintain a variety of diverse contract vehicles to address the many different needs and requirements which they need to fulfill. USAID will not be as successful as it could be unless it effectively utilizes all the different tools available to support foreign policy development initiatives. One of the aid delivery mechanisms that has worked very well for USAID has been the indefinite quantity contract. They grew in popularity and importance as a mechanism that allowed USAID to move money fairly quickly at a time when funding levels were increasing drastically and the operating expense needed to fund the robust procurement offices was shrinking quickly. The same can be said for USAID's move to leader with associate mechanisms and grants under contracts. They were all done to move money quickly and move the responsibility away from the contracting officers that couldn't handle the workload. The advantage of having the IQC was contractors were pre-qualified during a full and open competition and then had to again compete for each individual task order. Contractors complained that once eliminated from a specific IQC, they were virtually out of that sector for 5 years, and it is one of the disadvantages of using IQCs. Small businesses complain that while they were recruited and put onto a consortium, that a lot of times they didn't realize the amount of work that they thought they would get. Congress has recently expressed some concerns with IQCs for many of the same reasons I've cited above. I think it is important to make sure Congress is informed about about IQCs and the potential benefits they can have for the agency. A fact-based look at the importance of IQCs as a delivery mechanism was made to me during the Iraq War when I was the head of contracts. The U.S. government had decided that they would not declare war until they got agreement at the United Nations. Colin Powell was going up to address the United Nations, and we literally knew we were going to war, but we could not do anything because the administration did not want to make it look like it was a foregone conclusion. AID was sitting in the starting blocks. We were just on a hold until we finally got approval to go. Congress appropriated $1.6 billion in the first supplemental. Everybody was around the table, state, DOD, USAID, Commerce, Ag, you name it. Well, at the end of the day, when the smoke cleared, USAID was the agency that moved $1.2 billion of the initial $1.6 billion. And the way we did it was we had IQCs on the shelf. If we had not had IQCs, I'm not sure USAID as an agency would still be around. You talk to Andrew Natsios, he thinks that was the one thing that really helped keep the agency going until the good news that has come up recently. The new trend which we're hearing about is that is being considered is to move away from these large IQC mechanisms towards more traditional full and open competition, which is something that may eventually become a possibility as we start staffing up and getting the correct number of procurement personnel in the agency to make sure they can do their job. Full and open competition is embraced by the development contractor community, but it also can require longer lead times before obligations are funded and raise the cost of bidding on procurements. Also, full and open competition follows federal procurement regulations and, if not done correctly, can potentially lead to protests. Many contracting officers are fearful of protest and, as a result, may incorrectly select wrong instruments so they can avoid protest or shorten the time needed to obligate funds. Assistance is not done under FAR and can be awarded much faster and with much less risk. Many of my colleagues in the NGO and PVO community are always complaining to me that their cooperative agreements are being administered as if they are contracts. They are being directed and micromanaged by the COTRs on a daily basis. I have no idea whether this is true or not, but if so, it's possible the wrong delivery mechanism was selected for that particular requirement, or that junior officers are being asked to administer acquisition and assistance instruments that they're not yet trained to correctly oversee. All of us in this room would like to support President's bold development agenda and the administration's foreign policy objectives in Pakistan and Afghanistan. As a result, we want to make sure the administration sets goals and objectives that allow them to be successful and avoid criticism or scandal that can have severe negative effects in the future development assistance funding. We have all heard about the potential decision to terminate or at least to not to provide additional incremental funding to ongoing contracts and grants in Pakistan, and to provide general budget support, or use host country contracting, or move the funds to local NGOs. Certainly many of us in this room are familiar with these aid mechanisms and have experience working with them, and we also know they can work under the right condition. However, evidence-based decision-making can also show us where these mechanisms have been problematic in the past. Certainly in countries in conflict with high rates of corruption, passing large amounts of funding to governments without the appropriate contractual and financial systems in place can quickly lead to negative headlines and audit findings about foreign assistance money not being used to improve the lives of the most vulnerable and the needy, but to enrich the wealthy and the powerful. If this type of aid mechanism is being chosen for political reasons, then we would like to make sure that it is implemented after appropriate capacity development work on transparency and accountability is in place. Please rest assured it will not be Ambassador Holbrooke that will be blamed for large sums of unaccounted funds or inappropriate use of taxpayer dollars, but the administration for being so naive to go this way without proper conditions in place. The press will say they should have known that this problem was there and moving large sums of money too fast in that direction, and who was watching the store when this enlightened decision was made. And if history holds true, it'll probably be USAID that agreed to do this contracting approach that will receive the most blame. I believe, 2 minutes, man, I got so much to cover here. I believe we all need to be working to build local capacity and basically be trying to work ourselves out of a job with each solicitation that we submit to USAID. While it is not always possible in every sector and every country, if we are serving the client appropriately, success will include proposals that require local ownership and participation in senior level positions so they are ready to take over and run the project in the future. This will build much needed commitment and support, which is critical to sustainability. Select an implementation instrument that allows you to achieve the best possible results and evaluate both assistance and acquisition on how they're committed to capacity building. Finally, this is just my little thing. I've talked to a lot of people and talked to Andrew Natsios yesterday. We jumped on it. One of the concerns that jumps out at me after working in development for 35 years is public statements that I hear which are not based in any evidence that I'm aware of. When you hear that the NGO or the development communities are too expensive, ask yourself what people mean by expensive. We should be seeking the best value for the expenditure of taxpayer dollars, and I am not sure that the discussion is being framed correctly. Certainly in USAID, which I love and have worked with for years, much of the misunderstanding about cost realism revolves around an understanding, or I think I could respectfully suggest a total lack of understanding, of indirect cost and how it works. If someone has a higher indirect cost rate than someone else, they are automatically assumed to be more expensive. That is simply not a true statement. Please remember to ask, what is the base upon which the rate is being applied? Is it total direct labor, labor and fringe benefits, total direct cost? A smaller rate applied against a total direct cost can be much more expensive than a higher rate placed against just labor. Competition is the best friend of USAID in determining whether a cost is fair and reasonable. You simply will not survive in this business unless your cost is extremely competitive. If not, you simply will not have the pleasure and honor of doing development work in this town for very long. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
And now Rodney Bent, someone else who has seen it all, but from some other perspectives. First, let me thank Chemonics for putting up the $10,000 door prize that obviously drew you all here. I can't imagine why you would have come down here on such a rainy day. Let me apologize. I thought I was going to be able to put up a PowerPoint set of slides, and I guess because we're videotaping, I can't do that. There are handouts in the back, so some of the slides I was going to cover rather briefly, and from frankly a different perspective than what you've heard here.
What I would say is that you've had kind of the perspective of grants, contracts, from the aid perspective. I wanted to take a giant step back and frankly talk about not just AID, but also MCC, PEPFAR, not just grants versus contracts, you know, the 1,000 permutations of those instruments, but really what are we all about, and what are the kind of recurrent themes that I see in the Obama administration. I will also confess to some chagrin, since none of us are part of the Obama administration, so therefore we can confidently tell you what may or may not happen. The first slide that I had put up was really, and I won't go through all the elements of it, but it was sort of the 10 or 12 criticisms of foreign aid that I've heard in all my years on House Appropriations, OMB, out in the public, out in the field. And they range from, you know, it's not well coordinated, there are too many agencies, too many purposes, AID has been hollowed out, but I think the same thing could be said of frankly, any agency doing it, including the African Development Foundation or the IEF or the MDB. So it's sort of a generic point. Too many congressional earmarks, that foreign agencies don't do development anymore. Of course, what that means, who knows? That the reporting burdens on contractors, on recipients, on donors are too onerous. There's not enough of the right kind of information. You can see a lot of contradictory criticisms here, that the field doesn't appreciate what Washington's priorities are, and the reverse is the Washington doesn't appreciate what the field knows. So that's kind of the backdrop. How many people have gone to recovery.gov or data.gov in the last month? Okay, let me suggest that you do that. The reason is that I see some recurring themes in the Obama administration. The first is partnership. Secretary Clinton talked about that on Monday night, and the question is, well, what does partnership mean? At one level, obviously it means working with a whole different group of people. I guess they're handing the handout. Let me suggest some of the attributes of partnership are a little bit different than what we've been talking about to date. One part is certainly shared purpose, shared control, but it also means different and compatible strengths. It means that there is an equivalency of status that people are not used to, and it means mutual respect. Second, accountability. And I want to come back and then talk about the MCC in some of these particular areas, because I think the MCC is a good example of what can be done and how it can be translated to other agencies, other institutions. Accountability. The attributes in my mind are metrics, measuring outcomes as opposed to regulating inputs, candor, explicit monitoring, and meaningful evaluations. In other words, what is it that you're really doing? Transparency. Some of the attributes are you reveal internally and externally, and I know that this is incredibly uncomfortable for most agencies. You never want to talk about what didn't work. You want to coat with a fair amount of generality what you hope to do, because you're never quite sure. As 20 years ago when I worked for OMB, we had a SWAT team look at AID, and the assistant administrator at the time at PPC said, well, you have to realize that when we do sort of evaluations, we throw the dart and then we paint the target around where the dart has landed. And that metaphor sort of stuck with me because that's exactly wrong. What you want to do is to be quite explicit upfront about what you hope to achieve. Well, that requires a degree of risk-taking that is, in a zero-risk environment in this town, hard. If you know that you're going to have the IG and the GAO and everybody else, Washington Post, the New York Times, looking at everything that you do, there are a lot of disincentives for anybody who's smart, and most people I've seen in government are very smart. So part of the question for agency management is, how do you change those dynamics? How do you encourage people to take risks, knowing there will be failures? And failure is just part of what we're all about. Pragmatism. The attributes, and these are all sort of interrelated. You can see how the accountability and the transparency go together, but I think pragmatism too. Openness, avoiding the doctrinaire, looking at both sides of the coin, listening to all parties, changing that doesn't work. There is a lot, and I think Tony and I were talking a little bit before, there's a lot of experience about what doesn't work, and yet people bury it. It's out in the field. They don't want to talk about it. You'll be punished. If you are a lower-ranking employee and you go and you speak truth to power, bad things generally happen, especially if power wanted to do it that way. What I saw in Iraq was a lot of delusional thinking at times, and every once in a while you felt like screaming, "The emperor's got no clothes. Let's talk about that. You know, are we here to buy clothes, or are we here to mend them? And if they're not there, what do we do?" What does all of this mean to the foreign assistance community? And again, I'm talking really to the broad community. I'm talking to NGOs, contractors, consultants, agencies, people who are interested in this, think tanks, and I see a professor or two in the audience. On partnership, I think you have to pay close attention to the full polity within countries, government, civil society, business, labor. What are their priorities and relationships? How do you conduct meaningful consultation? MCC spent a huge amount of time trying to get that right, and I would argue we still don't. I'm still a little schizoid, you'll forgive me, that the MCC still doesn't have it right, that there are still lessons learned. Who do you talk to? How do you talk to? How do you bring out what their priorities are? I think some of the earlier discussion about partnerships really implied that we were going to hire other people who might be locals to do what we wanted to do. And I think part of the MCC difference is, now wait a minute, what is it that they want to do? If they want to do it, it's much more likely to be sustainable than if we want them to do what we think they should do. That is a different approach. It's a different way of thinking about what's important. And what, frankly, I've seen is that, I'll tell the story about Iraq. When I was there, irrigation is obviously hugely important in Iraq. And one of the senior advisors to the ministry was a guy, a very good engineer who came from West Virginia. And he went to the irrigation minister and said, the Iraqi irrigation minister, "Well, you know, we have 200 years worth of experience with canals in West Virginia." And the irrigation minister looked at him and said, "Well, with your 200 and our 5,000, we'll have 5,200 years." The point being that a lot of what we think we know really well, guess what? There are other perspectives and other things that they know better than we do. I think that we have to appreciate that partnership is much more than selecting and implementing instrument. It clearly goes into that, but it goes beyond hiring local staff. It goes more towards priority of and within the developing country. Developing norms to identify what makes a good partner. Thinking about what Tim was talking about, if you believe in transparency and accountability and you pick a local partner who does not have those same goals, guess what? You're going to have problems with that. I look at, and by accountability I also mean the information has to be meaningful. It doesn't mean that you reveal that you don't know something. It's got to be worthwhile. I'm going to move a little quickly because I know Tony's got the shepherd's hook out.
You're doing fine.
Knowing the complete picture within a sector. Too often what I've seen both on, when I was at OMB and certainly on the House Appropriations Committee is people would work on one link of the chain without looking at the entire chain. There's no point in building primary schools if you have teachers who are not trained, teachers who are not paid, you don't have a school lunch program, you don't have a textbook program, you don't have a series of places to go. And yet, frequently I will find that people will just focus on, no, we're building the schools. Well, yeah, but if you're trying to look at the net impact of what you're doing, you need to look at those other things as well. I think, frankly, that burden falls entirely on the implementing agencies, meaning AID, MCC, or PEPFAR. You can't go to a grantee or a contractor and expect them to paint the full picture. You really have to, that really is the government's responsibility. I think you need to be explicit about the beneficiaries and how they benefit. The MCC has put up on its website economic rates of return for every project. They're working on doing the beneficiary analysis. I think there's a ton more work and of intellectual capital and rigor that ought to be applied to this topic. It's what Congress wants to see. You know, one reason for the earmarks, and I never tire of saying this, is, you know, if you're going to propose a generality for an unknown country to do an unspecified number of things with unknown beneficiaries versus what a senator is hearing about from, I can do this in water, I can do that in education, guess what wins? And I think too frequently people have fallen back on executive privilege without appreciating that there is, in fact, a third way, which is that if you're quite explicit about what you want to do, risk noted, and you can lay out a good operational business plan at a level of granularity and specificity, that's the most effective way of fighting an earmark. You know, why is it that people want to put $200 million or more into something like water? It's real, it's tangible, it's a benefit. Why do they say so much for tropical forestry or other things? And I think that's a problem that needs to be confronted head on. monitoring and evaluation. Again, the MCC built this into the design of the project. You can't, after the fact, send a group of folks out and hope to have a meaningful evaluation of what goes on. What did you expect to have happen? What's the counterfactual? What's the database? Who's doing it? How do you get there? Those are all important things that I think are absolutely relevant to explaining why we do development assistance, and yet it becomes an afterthought. You have to distinguish, is this something that's useful for programmers within an agency to understand what worked or didn't work? Is it useful for portfolio analysis? You want to put more here, less there? Or is it useful to Congress and the executive branch? I'd submit it's all of the above. And frankly, I think that's what a lot of the QDDR and the PSD are about. Transparency, providing a frame of reference, amending and revising that frame of reference in discussion with partners. I think Rich Armitage one time in testimony said, no good plan survives first contact with the enemy. I think that's absolutely true. Dwight Eisenhower said it's not the plan that's important, it's the planning process. I think these are things that have to be explored and laid out, and again, I think the burden is going to fall on AID, MCC, PEPFAR, and whatever else. Pragmatism, I think there are far too many differing worldviews for only one approach to development, and in fact, I lived in Turkey when my father was an aid contractor, and I can remember back in the 60s, that was sort of infrastructure, and people talked about takeoff, and then it became basic human needs, and then it became policies, and then it became institution building, and then it became gap-filling analysis. Well, guess what? They're all right. And they're all sort of meaningless unless you can really talk the specifics. I'm going to race through to the end and just say that I think going forward, the Obama administration is just now starting to come together. I think that when Secretary Clinton on Monday night said something, a passing reference to OMB and the tough job that they had, I thought, thank God I'm not there, because it really is going to be tough. You look at the federal deficit going forward, and the deficit, just the deficit, not federal spending, the deficit is going to be 10 or 11% of GDP. Those are going to be frightening numbers, I think, for the Congress when they come back. And I think what that means is there's going to be huge scrutiny put on development assistance and foreign aid in general. You always get it, even in good times. You're really going to get it now. And I think part of the answer to that is, well, what are we getting? Why are we doing this? Let's explain it. Let's be candid. Let's talk about what didn't work, because then you can talk about what does work. My final point is, I think we spend too much time on focusing on the what's broken and not on what works. There are a lot of things that do work, and so when people look at assistance in the context of Iraq or Afghanistan, Pakistan, well, that's important, and you want to get that part of it right, and you want to do it right. But I will also say, let's look at what's going right in Latin America, in Africa, and other parts of the world. And there are a lot of really good things going on for which you are all responsible, and with that, I'll stop.
Well, I think my three colleagues really lived up to expectations in terms of giving you a lot from their own experience, and I think perhaps, Rodney summed it up very best with that last remark, that in a context where people are thinking about reform, looking at trying to make the system work better, that understanding and thinking about how to adapt things that really do work amidst many other things with which we're all less than fully satisfied is a really important thing to do. We've got a great turnout, and what I'd like to do is invite you to come up to either microphone.
I'm sorry, Steve Mosey. Perhaps
Well known to us all.
Perhaps it's coming in the context of an expectation that most of what you discussed in terms of past experience, in terms of a rational approach to contracting or different instruments, is perhaps passé, and the administration is trying to find, is there a better way beyond all of that? Is there a more political expedient way? Is there an absolutely lower cost way? Is there a political way to bypass most of what the development community has achieved in the past? Not necessarily saying it's wrong, but has it achieved enough? And I'm interested in your perspective on how do you get across the very extraordinary, thoughtful, empirically based, really, process and rational consideration that you just presented to us, to those who are very much in doubt about what all that rational process has achieved in the past. They're looking for other instruments, multilateral trusts, capital investment, joint venture activities, a whole slew of new multilateral funds that are outside the federal procurement process once you transfer the money, et cetera, et cetera. So on that side. Also, I'd argue that they're simply saying that any overhead costs, any indirect cost, no matter how rational or you define it, is too much, that it's not politically a value added that can be given in order to ensure local leadership, local ownership. So those are the challenges I'd put to you. How do you get across your wonderful presentations to those who seem to be having a predilection toward a very different worldview?
But your question's great, and I wish I had a magic answer to say, let's do this or let's do that. There are things that we're not capturing that are working really well out there. When I was the mission director in the West Bank, Gaza, when I was the mission director for the Regional Development Mission for Asia, I was responsible for USAID programming in Vietnam. One of the things that jumped out at us is Vietnam was trying to get ascension into the WTO, and all the donors were in the country, but nobody was talking to one another. So we formed a consultative group and got every ambassador at the table that was giving money. We started taking a look at who's doing what and dividing up the work. And all of a sudden, Vietnam goes to the second fastest growing economy in Southeast Asia behind China because people were working as a team. There is not donor coordination that I saw out there happening like that. And those are some of the things we need to think about how to move money and move it effectively. I wish I had the right answer for you. I'm working on it. Maybe next session I'll be able to do it. But these are really fundamental questions that we should all be talking about. I really, and I appreciate the question.
Rodney?
I have just a couple of points to add. One, I think the focus on what others are doing is a reaction to a sense of stovepiping within the U.S. government, that there's kind of, what is it when you talk about a particular country, what are other donors doing? And sometimes in Washington there's a blank look. I will honestly say in my experience, whenever I went to a country and you're out in the field, in fact the donors were really well organized. Everybody knew everybody else. They all talked about what the programs were. There was clearly a lot of sharing. But that information doesn't come back to Washington in a very organized way. And importantly, for planning purposes, for looking forward, whether you're at OMB or the House, what you want to know is not what DFID or AFD or the IDB is doing in a country today. You want to know, well, where are they likely to be 3 years from now or 2 years from now? So I think that's a broken feedback loop that does need to be fixed. I will also say, based on my experience, the World Bank and some of these other trust funds are not one whit cheaper than what the U.S. does. In fact, there's a lot of inefficiency built into I shouldn't use those words in public. There are a lot of extra costs that seem to be buried into those numbers. And I think when people scrutinize that, although there's a lot to be learned, and I'm a huge believer in frankly, using other donors, other private institutions, I don't think we do it nearly enough, and I think that's what the administration is groping for. I don't think it's any one instrument, whether multilateral or not.
Regarding the alliances, I mean, I agree, with Rodney saying, first of all, the way aid does things is very expensive. They put people on ground, they put families on ground, and that is a very expensive thing to do. However, with that is that they get a huge presence. I don't think any other foreign government does that. They usually just have projects, they just send people in, the flyovers. They send them in for, every couple of months to see how it's going on, and then they go out. You're looking at the costs, I really would have to analyze the cost to see if there's any real cost savings there. But what the U.S. government would lose if they basically just did these alliances, i.e. turn the money over to the World Bank, turn it over to the UN, they lose an incredible amount of authority. So I think that's an approach that has to be, funneled back and saying, yeah, you can look at the cost here, let's take a look at the cost there, and with that goes all of your authority.
The money that's being thrown at Afghanistan is having a negative impact rather than helping. And I wonder if you all might comment on that.
Mr. Afghanistan?
Anytime you throw huge sums of money, and I'm not just talking about the U.S. government and the Congress, but if you're in Afghanistan, there's funding coming in from a large number of people. A year ago, we were renting housing for our people and trying to keep them safe and secure, and one of the houses was running about $16,000 a month, which is a lot of money in Afghanistan. We went to renew our lease, and we were told that they were not going to renew our lease because somebody had come in and offered $32,000 a month for that particular house. And I was outbid by a U.S. government agency that wanted it over a contractor. So there is a natural tendency for corruption to raise its head when there's that kind of money, depending on who's owning the house, who's renting the house. Certainly, my fear is that the Afghans themselves, if the people that have the money are the ones that own those houses, they are not necessarily motivated for us to be successful and get out of Afghanistan. I heard this morning Karzai say, well, I'm glad that you guys are coming in, but we may need you 10 to 15 more years in this country before we're ready. And I'm concerned when I hear statements like that, and I'm concerned about how everything goes. So, yeah, I do think that large sums of money can, by their very nature, lead to problems that you're referring to, and I think certainly that's happening in Afghanistan.
Should we change the order, Diana?
Not really a lot to add. I think there's always the Willie Sutton rule of corruption follows the money. I think the challenge, frankly, in Afghanistan is twofold. One is sort of the direct assistance part of it, and that's clearly there. You see it in Iraq, see it in Vietnam 30 years ago. But really the more fundamental question is, how do you help the Afghanistan government build its capacity, build the systems, train the people? I don't frankly think it's a question of ethics. I think it's much more complex than that. It's cultural, it's a whole range of things. In that sense, I think Karzai is right. It will be 10 or 15 years, maybe 20, maybe 30, maybe 40. But what I think you can change are the expectations of Afghani citizens for their government or not. And I think, frankly, going in and assuming that you can create a Western-style government with social delivery systems that are going to be as good as they are in Switzerland or Finland is delusional. I think what you can say is, okay, well, what are the cultural norms? What can we do? Where do you want to start? How can you make systems more transparent? Civil service roles, civil service payment, civil service reform, the holy grail of anti-corruption efforts. I think there's a lot that could be done there.
I want to ask on the resourcing side, not so much on the instrument side, with specific regard to the idea of doing a foundation for USAID. Diana's done such nice benchmarking of other agencies in terms of what they've done, and there are some precedents for this. I know I looked at it years ago when we were putting together the Global Development Alliance, and we decided that wasn't the right solution at the time. But I wondered if either in terms of other agencies' experience and or the palatability from the health perspective or thoughts that you might have, Tim, if you could comment on would setting up a foundation, a USAID foundation, provide some agility and surge potential that or lasting opportunities that we don't currently have?
I mean, endowments have been set up, and I think that they work best when they're low profile and small and discreet. The Congress and the presidency like to take an annual view of how resources are spent, and so that mitigates against it. I think it would be unlikely for any large scale, the Jesse Helms idea of 15 years ago or 20 years, whatever it was. I wanted to see Jesse get up and say, yes, I in favor of giving $1 billion to a group of people that I won't control anymore. I think it goes back and forth. I think the arguments for an endowment are plausible if you accept that purpose doesn't need to be reviewed and you want to provide operating freedoms and flexibility. It doesn't really work if you want to have tight control, and frankly what I've seen is increasingly a desire for control.
Holly, we did an endowment down in Honduras, which we worked on. The one thing that struck me, I thought it was a great idea. It was going to generate money. It was going to leave a legacy for a period of time. The amount of work and labor that went into putting together a small endowment was beyond belief. It almost broke the back of the mission, legal counsel, contracts, everybody else. So I think a strong case can be made that they are very valuable if done right. I think you have to go into it realizing it's going to be a large commitment of time and resources to get it there correctly. So it's something everybody's proud of. So that would be my concern from a contractual point of view.
Yeah, I think the reason why they are so time-consuming, though, is that there is no current bureaucracy, right, to set this up. So people are very unfamiliar with it, and this was part of the thing that I'm saying as implementers is something we can look at, but because of AID's unfamiliarity with it, they want to see the regular standard forms that, you know, from OMB, and you're not going to get it here. You have to be innovative, and until AID gets more familiar with this and saying, well, it worked here and there, and this is going to be the format that we're going to use for this, I don't see them happening. But can it work? Yeah, absolutely.
Mike?
I think about some of the experiments that we've seen in the past few years about how we deliver aid, and chief among that, the MCC. And so I wonder if you can, and I appreciate very much your comments about how if it's something they want to do, it's much more likely to be sustainable, and your comments around the issues of accountability and how MCC has tried to target and manage that. And so I'd like the panelists' comments on that issue in particular, and maybe Rodney, you know, some of the comments on lessons we've learned about that approach, particularly in the context of Ambassador Holbrook's interest in trying to do something that might look like that in countries that probably the MCC wouldn't have considered on its list.
Right.
The
MCC obviously is, by using the indicator criteria, is trying to pick on a country level good partners. I think you can use some of those same criteria even where the country itself doesn't, from an MCC standard, meet it. Where I think what the MCC did that I think was valuable was the country consultative process, which you could mimic in any number of ways. But it's very difficult to do, and some of our early work wasn't very good, wasn't nearly as complete. You know, if you rely on newspaper, radio, TV, and yet you're in a village-based culture, you really have to change your norms. And so we spent 2 or 3 or 4 years kind of internally reevaluating what works and whether we're really getting the story. You obviously have to get out of the Capitol. You can't just talk to the planning minister, but how you do it, it's very intensive, very time-consuming, but worth doing. The second part of it is that I think you could create, we call them accountable entities at the MCC, but they're really sometimes you'd use a government, sometimes you wouldn't, but you could impose on that a much higher standard of accountability and transparency. But we also hired fiscal agents, we also hired procurement agents, we sent people out. The scarcest commodity in all of these countries is capacity. And so I think the challenge is, how do you build that capacity? And if you can't work within a ministry structure, is there an alternative structure that would work? I think in a lot of these countries, particularly conflict countries, post-conflict countries, that makes sense to look at those kinds of things, but you're going to have other problems, the $16,000 to $32,000 houses and all the rest of it. The MCC's footprint was generally 2 people. And so we didn't have to deal with a huge number of folks going over. We didn't have some of the problems that are associated with that. But how do you translate that in other settings? And I think you'd have to evaluate it case by case. I think one of the drawbacks that AID has is that they do assume a mission. They do assume a certain size footprint. They assume certain norms, what you're going to do for your staff, how they're going to live. And those are important. I think it's what makes AID sustainable in a lot of the countries in which it operates. But that's a very cumbersome, very expensive way of doing it. So, full stop.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, I think one of the things I referred to in my talk was to make sure that when you make decisions or you understand what you're doing, it's based in fact, it's based in evidence. We keep hearing about Holbrook wants to move money to the locals. He wants to make sure that Pakistanis get the money. If you take a look at USAID's Empowering Pakistan Firms, the proposal that we're fortunate enough to support AID on, we have 3 expats and about 156 locals as of this morning. Half of the staff are women that have not had opportunities to work in Pakistan. We're working in 11 different sectors to try to increase exports by 20% across the country in every one of those sectors. I believe that the talent, educational talent in Pakistan, that by the time we're through this project, they'll be able to run this on their own. But if they could increase exports by 20% across 11 sectors by themselves, they would have done it. They needed some expertise of people that had done this in other parts of the world successfully to come in and help them get down that short learning curve. I think there's a lot of stuff going on in Pakistan which is local based and that a lot of us get it. I'm not sure everybody that is making decisions understand what's taking place and have asked the right questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Mike Walsh with Inside NGO at this point. Thanks. My question is, we talked about delivery mechanisms. Steve talked about the aspirations of the administration for coming up with a delivery mechanism that obviously has great impact with minimum costs. Everybody's been trying to find that holy grail. The challenge, I think, though, and this has been alluded to by a couple of you, that the context is of risk avoidance. The government, the Capitol Hill in particular, is very suspicious of anybody who handles taxpayers' money. So, in fact, what you see more often is, coming from the Hill, is regulation after more regulations, burdening the process with nothing that really adds to the development. So, in that context, I shouldn't phrase it as how optimistic are you, but are there ways forward to somehow reconcile the suspicions of the Hill with the aspirations of the administration for accomplishing results with these delivery mechanisms?
What we're finding now in the industry is I am looking at 3 and 4 month time frames in which, what have you done for us? What are the results? What have we measured? We got to be able to show Congress really quickly what we're doing, and a lot of good work and money is going towards reporting on how we're doing, as opposed to going out and actually being able to do something. Now, we are responsible to Congress. They are under the gun. I think when I used to go up on the Hill, they said the toughest sell on the Hill of any program is appropriating money for foreign assistance, particularly in times like this where you've got recessions, you've got people out of money. It is really hard on congressmen. So congressmen want to go to their constituents and say, this money is being well spent, we're opening up new markets for U.S. goods overseas, so they've got to have a very strong argument to go against it. And I'm not sure that we don't need to educate Congress and educate everybody about the importance of allowing people to have more realistic timeframes to show that they can have meaningful, measurable results on the ground. But if you're constantly being bugged about what did you do for me today, I'm not sure that that's an effective way to do development. I'm not sure I answered your question, but.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think needs to be considered too is the very short time frame that aid sends their individuals to some of these countries. You'll get, people out there that for a year, and their responsibilities are what? Develop a program. By the time their year is up, if the program is fully developed, they're certainly not there for the implementation. So the next person's taking over, and they might have different views. So as an implementer, it's extremely difficult during this time to follow and to understand the logic. As we're all trying to move more towards, I think, transparency, milestone-based, and so you can more easily bring the success stories to Congress. It is becoming very difficult as you're getting, as Tim was saying, we're constantly reporting, then all of a sudden, you have a new requirement, a different report for a different aspect of your same program, and you're sitting there saying, where did this come from? It came from a different person who just took over. So, what am I optimistic about it? Not very.
I think I'd put the question this way. People aren't convinced that they're really understanding what's going on. And in some ways, I think that the initiative lies with the executive branch to define what they think the milestones are and what they think is important and whether they're achieving them. When Congress and outside folks don't see that, then they come up with the reporting requirements. They come up with ways that they ask the questions that are almost impossible to answer. I think, frankly, the blame has to go to the executive branch. I think it's incumbent on people to accept that there will be demands for information, and it's incumbent on the executive branch to define what they think is important after having had a lot of conversations with all of the people. There's nothing worse than the appropriations staff demanding a report on basic education, which was a priority for Mrs. Lowy. She got, frankly, what I would call a low-quality product because nobody was responsible for it. So the demands got more and more onerous. Well, I don't blame Mrs. Lowy. I think she's 100% correct. I frankly blame the executive branch for not answering it. It is just silly in a time where deficits are going to become paramount to frame the issue as, well, I could really do good stuff, or I could report to you on, things that you want. If you get into that, you're into a death spiral. They will set up a special inspector general. They will stick more people on you. You will spend vastly more time answering the wrong question than if you said, look, the right question is this. Let me tell you what we're going to do. Let me explain how we're going to measure it. Here are the milestones for, year one, month one, whatever it cares about. Go up and have a whole series of conversations before you even get asked the question. And then when you come back, try and do a hell of a good job in answering it. That's, an ounce of prevention here is worth 99 pounds of reports.
Do we, as the U.S., want to be involved across the board in every sector? Do we choose, on the basis of certain comparative advantages, to specialize? Right now, that choice doesn't get made. And it comes back to the points I think Rodney just spoke to, in which sort of everything is in play, depending on where it is. You can find a program in one sector or another in so many different countries. And the strategic framework behind it isn't there. The legislation includes, I've lost count of how many objectives have been written into the Foreign Assistance Act. So you're reporting against a whole set of continuously moving targets. And I think the PSD, there is an opportunity, although there's no way it could make all of us equally happy, but there is an opportunity for them to make some more explicit choices on priorities that would then flow down. And I think this whole reporting syndrome or reporting responsibility might be made somewhat more rational.
I had the experience recently to spend several years in Peru, where AID had outsourced to our company the job of advancing private sector-led agriculture development. The model that was used was simply to do what AID had done with an American firm. We outsourced it to Peruvian academic institutions, NGOs, and private sector. The program is widely known, highly successful, and it is a model that in development you have targets, expected results, and you say, what's the best means to do it? The military, the Defense Department does not build F-22s, they outsource it. AID outsources its work. The issue, in particularly in conflict countries like Afghanistan, how do you build the capacity of the local government to outsource development work? In the case of Peru, AID made the transition, the American contractor left, the Peruvian government copied the same program, implemented through the public sector. It's a big failure. You cannot execute development programs generally, as you cannot build F-22s in a public sector institution. And so this notion of outsourcing, I think the U.S. government has got it right. Acquisition, assistance are forms of outsourcing. These kinds of outsourcing capabilities need to be built into our client governments working overseas. And when you do that, you're going to start seeing success.
Thank you. Any comments or responses? Everyone agrees with you, Doug.
I agree. I'm Melissa Logan with Chemonics, and I'm also the co-chair of the International Development Task Force of the Professional Services Council. First, I'd like to thank all of you today for the great presentation, and for Betsy and the SID board for organizing this, because I think it's a topic that is incredibly timely. And clearly, as you said, by the turnout, very interesting to many and all of us in the development community. I actually have more of a comment, but would welcome your reflections on it, which is that starting where Tony began the conversation and stating that there's a lot of opinions out there about aid effectiveness and what are the best delivery mechanisms for it, but we seem to lack the evidence to back up many of the opinions that we had. And I guess my question or comment is, how do we continue this dialogue at this incredibly important time with the administration, who, as Steve pointed out, is looking at a variety of different options to improve aid effectiveness? Diana in her handout shared some of her opinions. Tony in his handout shared some of his opinions. How do we, as a community of professionals that are very, very passionate about making a difference around the world in people's lives, how do we come together to help inform this debate in a meaningful and substantive way as we move forward in this critical time? I know that Betsy and the SID team has a special program series planned, but I think let's challenge ourselves to take this one step further. How do we continue to engage in a meaningful dialogue with evidence about what are the most effective ways to deliver technical assistance that for international development? So that's my comment, and I would welcome any thoughts or reflections on it.
Thanks.
I know when Michael was the head of contracts at USAID, and certainly I did it when I was the head, I went out and I wanted to know what SID and Interaction and the Professional Services Council and what all of them thought about the job we were doing. And it really enabled me to, I think, make some big changes at USAID when they said, look, Tim, the IQCs, you've got 15 different pricing mechanisms. They're incredibly complex. It's hard for us to respond. That is the biggest problem we have. So I went back and looked at it, and I said, you know what, they're right. Why don't we simplify and standardize what we're doing? We came down with 2 formats, made it easier for industry. We were able to obligate money faster, and I wouldn't have come to that conclusion, as busy as I was, unless I was listening to what was going on out there. So these kind of forums are incredibly important to get that message out and to exchange information between USAID, which really cares about what's happening out there and how they can do a better job, and between industry that's saying, we want to serve you, but you're making it tough on us. So I think it's really important for us to keep open lines of communication. Another comment about I am not convinced that USAID is doing as good a job as it can yet. I think they're getting it and they're starting to work on it to get the good word out about some of the things happening in Afghanistan, Pakistan. Certainly, all of us in this room have probably got good news stories, but I am seeing really good things being done. And the word, I don't see it getting back here to Congress or anything, that we're capturing it as well as we did in the old days. I think back to Ellen Yout when she was in Legislative Affairs. They really got it on how to capture these stories and get it up to the Hill. And it may just be because the administration, I think Alonzo Fulgrim has done an incredible job of leading this agency and not being a political power. And if you live in this town, you know what I mean. His leadership was fabulous, but this is a political animal town. If you're not a political person, it's tough. Alonzo did a great job, but I'm not sure that he had the luxury of having people in LPA get back to capturing those good news stories and getting it up to the Hill. Because good things are happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the word's not getting out. We're exporting apples to India for the first time. They've never done that. Pomegranates to Dubai and all the stores. There's good things happening, but I just see a dearth of people capturing that information and making sure Congress knows that money is being well spent and things are being done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the 2 aspects is, one is, I think we all have to get better at capturing the anecdotal stories, the good stories, because we live in an environment that, you know, the press, the only coverage you tend to see is going to be the negative and not the positive, which is tough, but that's the nature of the beast, which we all know. But the other thing is, having worked at AID and having worked with the same groups that Tim was talking about, you tend to get, when you work for the government, inure to a lot of them because all you keep hearing is complaints. And if we, as now being on this side, turn it around when you're dealing with AID, present to them the positive aspect of a different way, positive way to do things, instead of, like I said, I was hearing a lot of negative things, which did help me form the regulations I was working on, but it really does help, I think, especially at this point, to present the options, the positive options to AID. And I think that's something that I'm here as, I guess, the representative for the nonprofit industry, or that it seems to be failing. Because we just tend to, when I go to conferences, just tend to hear the negative stuff, and I think let's start focusing on what is, something, an instrument that can work.
Right. If you look back at that trade-off sheet, there are, on that set of 10 or 11 things, there's certain things that at different points of time and in different locations, USAID and the U.S. government has tended to value pretty strongly and do better, significantly better, and sometimes significantly faster than other actors on the development stage. That's kind of gotten lost in the conversation as well.
Yeah.
Anything more, Rodney? Or okay, Irv?
Except to note that we've got 8 here.
Irving Rosenthal, presently a professor at American University. Maybe this is the wrong forum to ask this question. I'm a little embarrassed about asking it, but I will anyway. In the first session of every class that I teach, I ask the students, what's the purpose of foreign aid? And then you get the whole range from humanitarian, disaster, developmental, post-conflict, political. But by the end of the semester, most students are convinced that the purpose of foreign aid is political. Now, if that's really the case, have we been avoiding the elephant in the room in this discussion? Suppose Hillary Clinton does win out and becomes the director of foreign aid, and Jacob Lew becomes the budget officer in the planning office. Suppose Raj Shah really is an arm of Hillary, and he may be a good technical person, but not really a manager. So suppose we accept the fact and that the Kerry and Lugar bill will not be passed because Hillary Clinton has come out against it. And suppose aid then becomes really a political tool of the State Department. What kind of delivery mechanisms might be appropriate at that time?
Great question from a professor from American University where I got my master's degree. So I really appreciate the question. If you don't think that all of us on this panel have not been in conversations about that possibility, I think you'd be incorrect. Certainly there is concern, there was concern that the State Department could get much more involved in development, and as a result, development would become subsumed by short-term political goals that would happen. And I got into a discussion with some of the new technical officers I was referring to earlier, and the conversation was about Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they said, well, remember, USAID works in 80 countries around the world. And I said, you know, that's true. In fact, Chemonics is fortunate to work in many of those countries. I said, but the reason that these things come up is because at certain times in history, the money tends to go to politically sensitive areas. I worked in Latin America. I loved it. Great work. I thought we was doing a great job. They said, Tim, we're moving you to the Middle East. We're moving you to the West Bank Gaza program because that was up to $500 million a year. I went to the Middle East, and where was the money? It was in Egypt to keep Egypt from fighting Israel. It was in Jordan that was behaving themselves and supporting things. Lebanon, the whole Middle East was taking a lot of money. Now, aid was doing work around the world, but it was decreasing in Latin America, and at the time in E&E, although E&E took off with Bosnia-Herzegovina and other things. But the money, I hate to tell you, development is being done because we're concerned about people around the world. People like me that do this for a living. But if you follow the money's been political for a long, long time. And it just seems to be a nature of the beast that the money tends to follow political initiatives that are critically important to the administration, regardless of development. We do a great job, this country does a great job responding to disasters. I was in Thailand when the tsunami hit, and I had to deal with that for a long period of time. The U.S. government really shows how good they are at responding to those kinds of things. But I think as far as development tends to go and reward those countries that politically are doing things that we find appropriate. Rodney?
Not a lot. I mean, I agree with what Tim said.
Diana?
I think Dante said it best. If that happens, then it'll be abandon hope, all ye who enter. Sorry, but I don't see that at all as being positive. The only good thing I see, having worked in the government, is that it takes eons for change to happen. So if state, from my experience in working with state and their appreciation and their understanding, their application of the rules and protections and rights in there, it would, once that happens, it would change the whole face of this. But I don't see it happening immediately, and I think if it did happen, I really think it would switch back. I think the U.S., the public, contrary to what we see in the paper, I think they do have a development mentality. I think people, once they do see the purposes and uses and applications of it, do like it. They do get enjoyment out of that. They get satisfaction out of it. And I think the pendulum has swung so far, and I think it will swing back, but don't quote me on that.
Linda Nemec with Dexis. The questions that are being asked, I think, of our industry are scary. It really means, when you look at it, is that people do not understand the value that we add. If you talk about the questions about indirects, if suggestions are being made to pretty much take the industry out of the picture and give the money directly to another organization or to the local government, it means they don't understand the value we add. And I agree that the stories are important. I agree that we have to get the results out there, but they have to understand what it is we do and what the value is that we add. It's the same question we get from our families, that we get from our neighbors, we get from the people on the soccer field that say, what is it that you do? And I think we need a communication strategy that gets to the heart of that.
I'm also a SID board member, Joan Duty-Gayoso. I have just a couple of remarks. First of all, this is going to go back a few steps, but the old argument about who does aid cheaper and who has higher or lower overhead, I just want to put on the table that's a very old argument. I actually was associated with, under Peter McPherson, an effort to try to prove that the Canadians really weren't using fewer people than we were. And I think that's just a question that's always going to be there. And when you come down to it, it's sort of how you name things and which column you put them in, and it is pretty much equal across all various donors. The second point, Ms. Exposito talked about the UN putting a cap on administrative costs. Let me just clarify that. In the very beginning, the implementing agencies of the UN charged a 13% overhead. That was a political number. It didn't have anything to do with reality. Very small parts of UN programs were implemented by governments. Over the years, governments became more, and especially when they saw that they could get their hands on the 13%, that they could do the execution rather than have UN agencies do it. There was another negotiation in which I was deeply involved, in which basically we came up with another number. I don't remember right now what it was, but it was a political negotiation of member states. It didn't have, that the agencies did or didn't agree with. They were involved, but the decision was made by all the taxpayers represented there in the room. What was interesting in that process was that governments became more interested in implementing activities by themselves. And when you're in the UN system, you have less of this concern that happens in the bilateral program of the fact that if a government implements, they may be building their capacity, but it takes longer. I think in the bilateral program we had a shorter time horizon and were less patient with what the UN called government execution. On the instruments, two of them stood out that were mentioned, local currency and excess property. They're hard to use. Local currency isn't available in many places, but And we, at least when I was in aid, we encouraged the use of both. But managers found it difficult to use them. So more power to people who can figure out how to build partnerships and use those resources. But a lot of people felt they were more trouble than they were worth. One of the things that we haven't really dealt with much is some early remarks that moving money fast has been one of the things that shapes the kind of acquisition that we use. I also think it undermines our ability to accomplish our objectives because some things take longer. So I'd like to hear a little bit of discussion of that. I'd also, when the 32,000 house versus the 16,000 house came up, it was a good illustration, even though it was on the admin side, of the fact that different agencies have different capacities to pay. And I think they also have a different capacity to withstand risk. I think there are some agencies that get punished more than others for taking a bad risk. I think that willingness to take risk can be a good thing. But if there are different standards and different agencies are, I had this with USAID, Food Aid, and WFP Food Aid, so it isn't only something that happens in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you have different standards, then you're undermining yourself all along. And I will close because I heard a presentation on Monday by Rick Hill that really got me worried actually it was on security. But in both of these discussions, I am struck by how much what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan is shaping our whole approach to whatever we do. I was so happy to hear about Peru a few minutes ago. I mean, it's like the rest of the world has disappeared. And I agree with all the statements that were made about the political U.S. foreign policy interest and short-term foreign policy interest. I don't think those are going to go away. But we need to be careful that in places where we don't have those pressures, the way in which we do business that distortion doesn't get carried over into other places, because I think it will defeat our efforts.
Thank you, Joe.
I do not agree with spending money just to spend money. That is not, that is absolutely against my nature. But there is tremendous pressure to actually move the money quickly because there are so many needs out there. And the simple fact is, in the way that things work in Washington, if Congress appropriates USAID money and I don't get it obligated, or the agency doesn't get it obligated, it's a very difficult pitch the next year to say, I want more money. We couldn't handle what we got. So, I know you do. I know you understand. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but what happened is, because of this tremendous push to move money, because the OE was constantly being cut and we didn't have enough people to adequately do what we should have, which is each action is individual and you do it correctly and it goes for a certain means, we said, how in the hell can we do this and move this money? And so we looked at IQCs, we increased the ceiling, because the biggest problem I had as the director of contracts, my first 2 months, were people coming in saying, we just awarded a major IQC, it's been in place 7 months, and it's up against the ceiling. It's been so popular and they've used it so much that nobody can take a 4-year contract out because it's going to break the ceiling. And I said, who set the ceiling? It's just a guesstimate on how much we're going to spend. Let's put it up at $1 billion. Let's put it at $2 billion. I don't care. Let's not run out of money. So that was something that we had to do to move money. Grants under contracts, the contracting officers used to do all those. We said, look, we can't keep up with them. Why don't we push it to the contractor community, make them do everything that we have to do in the government, do all the procedures, report back to us, and we can move that off our plate to move the money. So listen, I'm not defending this as the ideal way to do contracting. I'm saying it was a necessity to survive. Fortunately, I'm here and I started out with good news. The agency's starting to bring talent back in. They're hiring contracts people. I went to a forum the other day. I did construction contracting in the Middle East. Not many people in aid know a thing about construction. Design, build, design, bid, build, they don't know it. I went there and I started talking to this guy. He's an engineer hired by USAID working in contracts, and he's bringing in ideas, and he said, why don't we have templates on there that these contracting officers can use? I walked out of that meeting going, man, we are on the right. We're doing some things good now, and I felt good about it. So please don't ask me to defend what we had to do. We're trying to survive. I didn't want to leave development money on the table because there are needs that the amount of money I had appropriated couldn't meet. So I didn't want to go into next year and say I get less money to hit bigger means. So that's kind of what drove that. I mean, some of the others may have thoughts about this.
Okay, please.
Hi, Laura Haig with the QED Group. I want to build on two of the things that two women had said previously about the communications. First, my bias is that I think using some more innovative, collaborative online tools, social media, whatever you want to call it, Web 2.0 would be really helpful for USAID and thinking about sharing best practices, learning, dealing with people, obviously leaving after a year and going to different other assignments. However, I think there are some resistant to that, and just want to hear your opinions on what you think are why USAID is resisting this and using these type of tools.
I don't think USAID is going to resist it in the future with the influx of the young people. Aid will be on Facebook in no time, and we'll have a page, and I think that, and I'm not being facetious. I'm somebody that doesn't have a Facebook page. I'm going to learn when I retire how to do it. But I think the young people are coming in and asking the same good questions you are. Hey, there are tools out there we're not utilizing that can really get our message out. And that's exciting for me to see, just working at Chemonics with the talent that I've got, the young talent coming in, it's just amazing. So I'm hoping that the suggestions you've got do take place and that we do start taking advantage of some of these things, and because I think there's some great stories that need to get out. So.
I think what is great about social media is that you're getting an immediacy, a personal approach that's almost uncensored, and I think that that's great because it tells a story. I think the inclination, particularly at agencies, is that blogs become just like press releases, I don't think that's a very healthy aspect, because I think what people want is the raw, the unfiltered, the personal, the perspective. But I think also that you have to go beyond sort of what are the agencies doing. I think there's a whole group of NGOs and companies and partners, think tanks, universities, foundations who are doing this, and I think there's a lot to be learned from them, and I frankly think just, embrace the change.
Diana, anything to wrap up?
Yeah, no, I mean, the risk with that, of course, is that someone in our group is going to go out and you're going to see, the version of Girls Gone Wild meets AID, and that's not going to go over well. But I just think it's going to go, you have to really look at the risk management here and just saying there's a lot of positives to this. And I think, Rodney and Tim really captured it really well. People do want to see the raw data. They want to experience it that way. And that is the way we're going, and people have to get over the fear. But I think that's what, to answer your question, why isn't it being embraced more? It's just fear.
I'd like to thank the panelists. We had a theme that we couldn't fully develop just in one conversation in a couple of hours, although we covered a lot of really good ground. And that is this theme about the facts, the data, and the evidence. And what makes me hopeful, although perhaps a little wary, given the time frames they have to work on with the PSD and the QDDR, is will they get to see the evidence? You hear some people involved saying, well, we just don't have any. So we're going to have to go with what we've heard and what we think we know. I think that's a challenge to everybody in the room and to the whole development community, and I would invoke the words of Mick Jagger when it comes to evidence. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you get what you need. Now, to Betsy, because I think you have some thoughts, just to close, of what SID-Washington might do to give them what they need.
Well, we've had an inspiring session today, and we've had a true variety in the people who have been quoted by our panelists. And I think it is going to be fun when we see this video and get to see all of those different people. We'll just have to line them up in a column and say, what did they have in common? They were quoted on the December 9th panel on delivery mechanisms. Why are we videotaping? We're videotaping because we also believe it is really important to get these stories out, the thoughts, the data, the evidence. It's walking around in the development community. SID is in a special spot because we're not an advocacy organization. We're not a trade association. We're just a professional association really dedicated to substantive exchange. So we're a nice sort of forum to be able to surface this kind of data on behalf of the development community and try to get it to the different places that really, really do need to hear it today. We're obviously not the only place. We are knocking at the door of the QDDR process and at the Presidential Study Directive process. We would really like to bring the development community into that discussion and bring the evidence, the data that sits in the room with our organization to those processes. But it's one where I think we all just really have to rally both individually and collectively, take the challenge that I think many have put out in the room today. Make your evidence available. We're also trying to do that through SID. We're videotaping, we've got handouts, we're going to share them. If we really are able to engage more than just inviting those folks making those decisions to our audiences, we will also be doing that. We're going to be having other fora like this one to try to do that. But I think this really is something where individual and collective is a good thing. We also have an acquisition and assistance task force at SID, and you will be seeing shortly a survey going out to our entire some 6,000 person listserv, and there will be a lot of opportunity in that survey to also bring forward some of your thoughts on all of these issues, which we will also be sharing in a variety of different ways. So I think the call is, please keep coming to these things, making your views known, also sharing them directly with those making decisions. I heard the word fear or wary. Let's not be that way. I think that when people like Gail Smith and Anne-Marie Slaughter are walking around, they are saying, we are open, we want to be evidence-based. So they're saying they really want to hear from people. I think we just need to really, really respond to that and make sure that this data is shared and that we do get to influence the outcome of decisions that we really care about. So thank you all so much for coming today. And I really want to say myself, thank you to our panelists. They were fabulous, all, as Tony said, we could have expected, and then some. And Tony, you were a fabulous moderator, as ever. So a big round of applause for them and to all of you for coming.